20 years. That's how long it's been since I discovered the truth about my husband, Michael. And even now, sitting in my Phoenix living room in 2024, I can still feel the weight of those secrets pressing against my chest like stones. I'm 56 now, a woman who's learned that time doesn't heal everything. It just teaches you how to carry the pain differently. Back in 2004, I was 36, a high school biology teacher who thought she understood life, death, and everything in between. I was wrong about so many things. Michael died on a Tuesday in March 2004. A stroke, they said. 38 years old, healthy as a horse, and gone in an instant. The doctors at Valley Regional Medical Center used words like unprecedented and tragic anomaly. But medical terminology couldn't fill the crater his absence left in my world. We'd been married 14 years, and I thought I knew everything about the man who left his coffee cup on the nightstand and hummed off key in the shower. He was my partner, my best friend, the person who remembered to water my plants when I forgot, and who could make me laugh even when I was grading papers until midnight. The house felt impossibly quiet after his funeral. Our modest ranch-style home in central Phoenix, with its desert landscaping and the little herb garden Michael had planted for me, became a monument to everything I'd lost. I'd catch myself setting 2 plates at dinner, brewing enough coffee for both of us, turning to share a joke with empty air. 6 months passed in a blur of casseroles from neighbors, sympathy cards that said nothing helpful, and well-meaning friends who told me Michael was in a better place, as if they'd personally received a postcard from heaven. I threw myself into teaching, staying late to avoid going home to that silence. But even surrounded by chattering teenagers discussing cellular respiration, loneliness followed me like a shadow. Sleep became my enemy. I'd lie awake staring at Michael's side of the bed, his pillow still holding the faint scent of his cologne. Some nights, I'd find myself going through his things, his dresser drawers, his desk, his toolbox in the garage, searching for something. Though I couldn't name what. Looking back now, I think part of me already sensed there were pieces missing from the puzzle of our life together. Little inconsistencies I dismissed as forgetfulness or work stress, the occasional phone calls he'd take outside, the way he'd sometimes stare off into space, with an expression I couldn't read. The unexplained charges on our credit card that he'd wave off as work expenses. But grief has a way of making you question everything and nothing all at once. I told myself I was imagining things, that loss was making me paranoid, that a good wife doesn't go digging through her dead husband's secrets. How naive I was. If I could go back and warn that broken woman shuffling around in her bathrobe and Michael's old t-shirts, I'd tell her to brace herself. The man she'd mourned for 6 months was about to become a stranger, and the life she thought they'd shared was built on lies that would soon come crashing down around her. But maybe I wouldn't change anything. Maybe some truths are worth the price of discovering them. The first crack in my carefully constructed grief appeared on a September afternoon when I returned to Valley Regional Medical Center. I'd been avoiding the place for months, but I needed Michael's medical records for the insurance company, another bureaucratic hoop to jump through in the endless paperwork of widowhood. The familiar antiseptic smell hit me as soon as I walked through those sliding glass doors. My stomach clenched, and for a moment I considered turning around and leaving. But I forced myself forward, following the familiar path to the administrative office, where a tired-looking woman behind bulletproof glass processed my request with practiced indifference. While waiting for the paperwork, I wandered the halls where I'd spent those final, terrible hours. The ICU looked exactly the same beeping machines, the same fluorescent lights, that made everything look sickly and pale. I found myself standing outside what had been Michael's room, number 314, remembering how I'd held his hand and whispered promises I'd never be able to keep. That's when I heard them. 2 nurses stood at the station, just around the corner, their voices low, but carrying in the way hospital conversations do. I wasn't trying to eavesdrop. Grief had made me invisible, just another broken person haunting these sterile halls. But when I heard Michael's name, my feet froze to the linoleum floor. The older nurse, someone I didn't recognize, was shaking her head. Her voice held a weight I couldn't identify as she spoke to her younger colleague. She mentioned something about room 314 being sealed immediately after Michael's death, how his personal effects had disappeared before I could claim them. Then she said the words that would haunt me for months. She still doesn't know, does she? If she finds out what really happened, we're all finished. My heart hammered against my ribs. The younger nurse glanced around nervously before responding, but I couldn't make out her words. All I caught was something about protocols and the importance of keeping quiet. I pressed myself against the wall, straining to hear more, but they moved away, their conversation fading into the ambient noise of the hospital. I stood there for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes trying to process what I'd heard. What didn't I know? What had really happened? And why would knowing the truth finish anyone? The questions followed me home and kept me awake that night. I replayed every moment of Michael's final day, searching for clues I might have missed. He'd complained of a headache that morning, nothing unusual for someone who worked long hours at his engineering firm. By noon, he was unconscious. By evening, he was gone. But now those memories felt different, tainted by the possibility that I'd been fed a lie. I remembered how quickly they'd moved his body, how his room had been cleared and cleaned before I could collect his wedding ring and wallet. At the time, I'd assumed it was hospital efficiency. Now, I wondered if it was something else entirely. The insurance paperwork sat unopened on my kitchen table for 3 days while I wrestled with a decision. I could let sleeping dogs lie, continue my quiet life of grief and gradual healing. Or I could start asking questions that might lead to answers I wasn't prepared to handle. Michael had been my anchor, my certainty in an uncertain world. If there were secrets about his death, did I really want to know them? The decision was made for me 3 weeks later when I received a text message from Michael's phone. I was grading lab reports on a Thursday evening, red pen in hand, when my phone buzzed. The sender's name made my breath catch in my throat, Michael Hartwell. For a moment, the rational part of my brain tried to explain it away. Maybe the phone company was recycling numbers. Maybe it was some cruel prank. But my hand shook as I opened the message. Check the garden shed. Behind the paint cans, you deserve the truth. I dropped my phone like it had burned me. Michael's phone had been missing since the day he died. I'd assumed it was lost in the chaos of the emergency room. His smartwatch, too. The hospital staff had claimed they'd looked everywhere, but personal items sometimes disappeared in medical emergencies. I'd been too devastated to push the issue. Now, apparently his phone was sending me messages from beyond the grave. My first instinct was denial. Someone was playing a sick joke. But as I sat there in the lamplight of our living room, surrounded by the familiar chaos of student papers and coffee cups, I realized something chilling. Very few people knew about our garden shed, and even fewer knew that Michael stored paint supplies back there. We'd only moved the cans there last summer when we'd repainted the guest bedroom. The shed sat at the back of our property, a small metal structure Michael had installed to store lawn equipment and seasonal decorations. I'd avoided it since his death. Too many memories of him tinkering with the mower or organizing his tools with the methodical precision that had made him such a good engineer. I grabbed a flashlight and walked through the darkness of our backyard desert wind, rustling through the Palo Verde trees. The shed smelled like motor oil and dust when I opened it. Michael's tools hung in perfect order on the pegboard he'd installed, each outlined in black marker so he'd know exactly where everything belonged. The paint cans were stacked in the far corner, just as we'd left them. Behind them, wedged against the wall, was a manila envelope sealed with packing tape. My name was written across the front in Michael's careful handwriting. Inside, I found documents that made no sense at the time. Medical records for someone named Lily Martinez, a 6-year-old girl with a rare genetic condition I'd never heard of. Research papers about immune system anomalies. Financial records showing monthly payments to something called the Pinnacle Bio-Research Corporation. And strangest of all, a small velvet jewelry box containing a delicate sapphire ring sized for a child. At the bottom of the envelope was a handwritten note. If something happens to me, protect Lily. She's innocent in all this. The truth is bigger than both of us, but she doesn't deserve to pay the price. I sat on the shed floor for an hour, flashlight beam dancing across these mysterious documents, trying to understand what my husband had been involved in. Who was Lily Martinez? Why did Michael have her medical records? And what did any of this have to do with his sudden death? The text message had promised truth, but all I'd found were more questions. Questions that would lead me down a path I could never have imagined, to discoveries that would shatter everything I thought I knew about the man I loved and mourned. That night, I didn't grade a single paper. Instead, I began the investigation that would consume the next year of my life. The address on Lily Martinez's medical records led me to a modest apartment complex in South Phoenix, the kind of place where working families stretched every dollar and children played in dusty courtyards while their parents worked double shifts. I sat in my car for 20 minutes, engine running air conditioning, fighting the October heat, while I gathered courage I didn't know I possessed. 6 months ago, I would never have imagined myself as the type of woman who shows up unannounced at strangers' doors, clutching mysterious documents and demanding answers. Grief, I was learning, could transform you into someone you barely recognized. The woman who answered apartment 2B was younger than me, maybe early 30s, with tired eyes and paint-stained fingers. Her black hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, and she wore scrubs that suggested she'd just gotten home from a healthcare job. When I asked if she was Rosa Martinez, mother of Lily, her face went pale. She tried to close the door, but I was faster than she expected. The words tumbled out of me. Michael's death, the hidden documents, the sapphire ring. I watched her expression shift from fear to resignation, to something that looked almost like relief. Rosa invited me inside, with the weariness of someone who'd been waiting for this conversation for months. The apartment was small, but immaculately clean, decorated with a child's artwork and photographs of a beautiful little girl with dark curls and Michael's eyes. Those eyes stopped my heart. Even in photographs, the resemblance was unmistakable. She made coffee with shaking hands while I sat at her kitchen table staring at school photos that could have been Michael as a child. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. She told me about meeting Michael 5 years earlier at a medical conference where she'd been working as a translator. He was there consulting on a biomedical engineering project. She was trying to navigate the complex world of experimental treatments for her daughter's rare condition. Lily had been born with a genetic mutation so uncommon that doctors had initially told Rosa to prepare for the worst. But instead of making her sick, the mutation seemed to give her body an almost supernatural ability to resist infections and toxins. She was what researchers called a medical anomaly, a child whose DNA held secrets that could potentially save thousands of lives. Rosa's voice broke as she described the impossible choice she'd faced: watch her daughter suffer without treatment or enroll her in experimental programs that felt more like exploitation than medicine. Michael had offered a third option. He knew people had connections. He could get Lily into a legitimate research program where she'd receive care while contributing to science in an ethical way. What Rosa didn't know until it was too late was that Michael had forged her signature on consent forms, bypassing her parental rights to enroll Lily in programs she'd never approved. He told himself it was for the greater good, Lily would get treatment, science would advance, everyone would win. But good intentions, Rosa learned, could pave roads to places darker than either of them had imagined. As she spoke, I found myself studying this woman who had shared something with my husband that I never could a child. Part of me wanted to hate her, to blame her for the deception that had poisoned my marriage. But looking at her exhausted face, at the photos of a little girl who'd inherited Michael's stubborn chin and gentle smile, I realized we were both victims of his complicated love. Rosa poured coffee into mismatched mugs while I absorbed the reality that my husband had fathered a child with this woman. The kitchen felt too small for the weight of what we were discussing. Sunlight streaming through cheap blinds and illuminating dust motes that danced between us like secrets finally set free. I expected to feel rage, betrayal, the scorching pain of infidelity. Instead, I felt hollow, as if someone had scooped out my insides and left only questions echoing in the empty space. Rosa seemed to sense my confusion because she sat across from me and began speaking in the measured way of someone who'd rehearsed this conversation in her mind countless times. She told me about Michael's first visit to their apartment 3 years earlier, how he'd knelt down to Lily's eye level and listened with genuine interest as she explained her collection of smooth desert stones, how he'd started showing up on weekends, bringing educational games and children's books, teaching Lily about science in ways that made her laugh. The affair, if you could call it that, had lasted only a few months. Rosa made it clear that neither of them had intended for it to happen. Two lonely people thrown together by extraordinary circumstances, finding comfort in each other while navigating the frightening world of experimental medicine. When she discovered she was pregnant, Michael had been as shocked as she was, but he'd never abandoned them. Even after they'd agreed to end their romantic relationship, he'd remained devoted to Lily. He'd set up the monthly payments to cover her medical expenses, attended her kindergarten graduation, and spent hours on the phone with doctors and researchers advocating for better treatments. Rosa pulled out a photo album, and I found myself looking at pictures I'd never seen Michael pushing Lily on swings, helping her build sandcastles, reading bedtime stories with the same gentle expression I'd seen him wear when he thought I wasn't watching. These weren't the stolen moments of a guilty father. They were the everyday interactions of someone who'd claimed his role in this child's life completely. Have you ever discovered a secret that changed everything you thought you knew about someone you loved? That moment when the person you mourned transforms into someone entirely different, leaving you grieving, not just their death, but the death of your understanding of who they were. I thought about all those Saturday mornings when Michael said he was playing golf, all those business trips that lasted just a little too long, all those times I'd found him staring out the window with an expression I couldn't read. He hadn't been having an affair in any traditional sense. He'd been living a double life as a father. Rosa showed me Lily's most recent medical reports, explaining the complexity of her daughter's condition in terms my biology background helped me understand. The mutation wasn't just rare, it was revolutionary. Lily's immune system functioned unlike anything doctors had seen before, potentially holding keys to treatments for autoimmune diseases, cancer, even certain genetic disorders. That's when Rosa's voice grew dark, and she told me about Pinnacle Bio Research Corporation. What had started as legitimate medical research had evolved into something far more sinister, something that had begun treating Lily less like a patient and more like a commodity. And Michael had discovered their true intentions just days before his death. Rosa disappeared into her bedroom and returned with a shoebox that contained 3 years of Michael's secret life. Letters he'd written to Lily, but never sent crayon drawings she'd made that he'd carefully preserved, and dozens of photographs documenting a relationship I'd never known existed. The evidence of his deception was overwhelming, but it was the tenderness in these artifacts that devastated me. This wasn't the calculated betrayal of a cheating husband. It was the desperate love of a man torn between two worlds he couldn't reconcile. I picked up a Father's Day card Lily had made construction paper, decorated with glitter, and the shaky handwriting of a 6-year-old. "Thank you for making me feel better, Daddy Mike." The word daddy hit me like a physical blow. All those years I'd grieved our childlessness, convinced that Michael shared my sadness about our empty nest he'd been tucking another child into bed across town. Rosa explained how carefully Michael had compartmentalized his life. He'd never brought Lily to our neighborhood, never mentioned her existence to mutual friends, never let his two worlds collide. He'd been methodical about it the same way he approached his engineering projects, every detail planned, every contingency considered. Except he hadn't considered how the weight of living two lives would eventually crush him. The sapphire ring I'd found made sense now. September was Lily's birth month, and sapphires were her birthstone. Rosa showed me the matching necklace he'd given their daughter for her 6th birthday, just weeks before his death. She'd been wearing it the day he collapsed, and Rosa had later learned it was the last gift he'd ever give her. I thought about all those evenings Michael had seemed distant, all those times I'd caught him staring at nothing with haunted eyes. I'd attributed it to work stress, maybe early midlife crisis. Now I understood he'd been carrying the exhaustion of loving two families while belonging fully to neither. The monthly payments to Pinnacle Bioresearch made sense too. Michael had been funding Lily's treatment through the research program, convinced he was securing her future while advancing medical science. The financial record showed increasing amounts over time, not just medical expenses, but what looked like private payments to individual researchers and administrators. Rosa's expression darkened as she explained what those payments had really been buying. Michael hadn't just been paying for Lily's care. He'd been paying for access, for special treatment, for assurances that his daughter would remain in the program despite Rosa's growing concerns about the increasingly invasive procedures. She showed me consent forms, bearing her forged signature documents she'd never seen before, that authorized treatments she'd never agreed to. Michael's careful engineering mind had solved the problem of Rosa's resistance by simply bypassing it, creating a paper trail that gave Pinnacle everything they needed while keeping Rosa in the dark about the true extent of their research. But forgery had been only the beginning. As Lily's case became more valuable to Pinnacle's research goals, the stakes had grown higher. What started as monthly blood draws had escalated to tissue samples, bone marrow extractions, and experimental procedures that pushed the boundaries of ethical medical research. Michael had created a monster he couldn't control, and by the time he'd realized the full extent of what he'd unleashed, it was too late to protect either Lily or himself from the consequences. Rosa's hands trembled as she pulled out the final folder from her shoebox, a collection of documents that Michael had smuggled out of Pinnacle Bioresearch in the weeks before his death. These weren't medical records or consent forms. These were internal communications research proposals and budget projections that revealed the true scope of what Pinnacle was doing with children like Lily. The company had marketed itself as a cutting-edge medical research facility, the kind of place where breakthrough treatments were developed to help rare disease patients. Their brochures featured smiling families and talked about hope, innovation, and the promise of tomorrow. But the documents Michael had stolen painted a very different picture. Pinnacle had identified dozens of children across the Southwest with rare genetic mutations, each one representing a potential goldmine of biological data. They'd developed a systematic approach to recruiting these families, targeting desperate parents who were running out of options for their sick children. Michael had been one of their most successful recruiters, his engineering background and genuine concern for Lily making him the perfect liaison between the company and anxious families. What Michael hadn't understood initially was that Pinnacle's research goals extended far beyond helping sick children. The company had contracts with pharmaceutical corporations, biotechnology firms, and according to some documents, defense contractors interested in developing biological countermeasures for military applications. Lily's specific mutation was particularly valuable because her immune system's resistance to toxins could potentially be reverse engineered to create treatments for chemical and biological weapons exposure. The implications were staggering. Her DNA could be used to develop medical countermeasures that could save soldiers' lives, but it could also be used to create more effective weapons. Rosa showed me correspondence between Pinnacle researchers discussing harvesting protocols and genetic material optimization. They talked about these children like they were laboratory specimens, not human beings with families who loved them. One email chain discussed the challenges of obtaining sufficient tissue samples from uncooperative subjects and strategies for convincing parents to consent to more invasive procedures. Michael's name appeared throughout these documents, initially as an enthusiastic supporter of the research. His early emails showed genuine excitement about the potential to help children like Lily while advancing medical science. But I could trace his growing discomfort through the progression of his communications, watching as his tone shifted from enthusiasm to concern to outright alarm. The turning point seemed to come when he'd learned about something called Phase 3. Rosa's voice dropped to a whisper as she explained what Michael had discovered. Pinnacle planned to create a residential facility where children with valuable genetic mutations would live permanently, ostensibly for their own protection and optimal care, but really to provide researchers with unlimited access to their biological material. The children would be removed from their families under the guise of medical necessity. Parents would be told their children needed constant monitoring and specialized care that could only be provided at Pinnacle's new facility. But once the children were isolated, there would be no oversight, no limitations on what procedures could be performed. Lily had been selected as one of the first candidates for Phase 3. Michael had found her name on a preliminary transfer list along with a dozen other children whose parents had already signed custody agreements without fully understanding what they were agreeing to. That's when Michael had tried to withdraw Lily from the program, entirely setting in motion a chain of events that would ultimately cost him his life. Rosa's voice barely rose above a whisper as she showed me the most disturbing documents Michael had stolen. Detailed research protocols that revealed Pinnacle wasn't just studying these children's genetic material, they were cloning it. The company had developed a process for creating synthetic versions of the children's unique immune responses, essentially manufacturing artificial versions of their DNA for mass production. The applications were breathtaking in their scope and terrifying in their implications. Pinnacle had partnerships with military contractors who wanted to create soldiers immune to biological weapons. Pharmaceutical companies were interested in developing treatments for autoimmune diseases. Even more disturbing were the connections to private security firms that seemed interested in creating enhanced immunity for high-value personnel in dangerous regions. But the most chilling revelation was buried in a budget proposal dated just 2 weeks before Michael's death. Pinnacle was planning to harvest bone marrow and vital organ tissue from the children in Phase 3, claiming they needed fresh genetic material to maintain the viability of their cloning process. The document referred to this as renewable resource extraction and included projections for how frequently they could perform these procedures without causing permanent damage to their subjects. Lily's name appeared throughout these projections. Her rare mutation made her genetic material particularly valuable, and the researchers had calculated that they could extract enough tissue to supply their cloning operations for years. The procedures would be painful and potentially life-threatening, but the profit margins justified the risks in their cold calculations. Michael had discovered all of this during what should have been a routine visit to review Lily's treatment progress. He'd been left alone in a conference room where someone had carelessly left a laptop open to these internal documents. His engineering mind had quickly understood the implications of what he was reading, and he'd used a thumb drive to copy everything he could before anyone returned. Rosa showed me printouts of the emails Michael had sent in his final week's desperate attempts to withdraw Lily from the program before Phase 3 could begin. But Pinnacle's response had been swift and unambiguous. Michael had signed legally binding agreements on Rosa's behalf, giving them custody rights that couldn't be easily revoked. If he tried to interfere with their research, they would take legal action that could result in Rosa losing custody entirely. The threats had escalated quickly. Michael received calls at home at work from men who claimed to represent Pinnacle's legal department, but whose voices carried implications that went far beyond courtroom battles. They reminded him that he'd committed fraud by forging Rosa's signature, that he could face criminal charges if he didn't cooperate. They mentioned details about our life together that they shouldn't have known: our address, our routines, even the name of our veterinarian. Michael had become a man caught between impossible choices. He could expose Pinnacle's conspiracy and face criminal prosecution while potentially losing Lily to a custody battle Rosa couldn't win. Or he could stay quiet and watch them harvest tissue from a child he'd grown to love like his own daughter. In the end, he'd chosen a third option. Michael had contacted a journalist named Samantha Cross, someone with experience investigating medical research fraud. He'd arranged to meet her the day after his death, planning to turn over all the evidence he'd gathered and trust that media exposure would shut down Pinnacle's operation before Lily could be harmed. But someone at Pinnacle must have learned about his plans because Michael never made it to that meeting. The final piece of evidence Rosa showed me was a handwritten letter Michael had left in her mailbox the night before he died. His usually neat handwriting was shaky, rushed, as if he'd been writing under enormous pressure. The letter was dated March 15th, 2004, the day before his stroke. In it, he confessed everything: the forged signatures, the secret payments, the growing realization that he'd delivered Lily into the hands of people who saw her as nothing more than a valuable commodity. He'd tried to be her protector and had instead become her jailer, creating legal bonds that gave Pinnacle control over her future while keeping Rosa powerless to intervene. The letter revealed that Michael had spent his final weeks trying to build a case that would expose Pinnacle while protecting both Lily and Rosa from retaliation. He documented everything: photographed internal documents, recorded phone conversations, even captured video footage of children being subjected to painful procedures at Pinnacle's main facility. He'd hidden copies of this evidence in multiple locations, including our garden shed, and planned to release it all simultaneously to journalists, law enforcement, and medical ethics boards. But Pinnacle had been monitoring him more closely than he'd realized. The letter described how he'd been followed home from work, how his phone calls were being intercepted, how people had been asking questions about him at his office. Someone had broken into his car and gone through his papers. His computer at work had been remotely accessed and files had been deleted. Most chilling was his description of a meeting he'd been forced to attend at Pinnacle the day before his death. Dr. Rebecca Sterling, the head of research, had made Pinnacle's position crystal clear. Michael could continue cooperating with their program, or they could make his life very difficult. They had enough evidence of his document forgery to send him to prison, which would leave Rosa facing Pinnacle's custody claims without any support. But Dr. Sterling had offered him an alternative. If Michael agreed to recruit more families for their program using his credibility and engineering background to convince desperate parents to enroll their children, Pinnacle would ensure Lily received the best possible care. They'd even provide Rosa with a substantial monthly payment to help with her living expenses, framing it as a research stipend rather than what it really was, payment for her daughter's genetic material. Michael had refused, and that's when the threats became more specific. Dr. Sterling had mentioned how tragic it would be if something happened to him, leaving Rosa to navigate Pinnacle's complex legal agreements without his help. She'd spoken about industrial accidents, medical emergencies, the unfortunate reality that people sometimes died unexpectedly, especially when they were under stress. The letter ended with instructions for Rosa to contact Samantha Cross if anything happened to him, along with locations where he'd hidden additional evidence. He'd also included a separate note for me, though Rosa hadn't known it existed until after his death. In it, he apologized for the deception, but asked me to help protect Lily if the truth ever came out. Reading his final words, I realized that Michael hadn't died of a sudden stroke. He'd been murdered for trying to save a little girl from people who saw her as nothing more than a source of profitable genetic material. And now, 6 months later, those same people were still out there, still harvesting tissue from children whose parents had no idea what was really happening behind Pinnacle's medical facade. Driving home from Rosa's apartment that evening, I couldn't stop thinking about the timeline. Michael's letter was dated March 15th. He died on March 16th. The meeting with journalist Samantha Cross had been scheduled for March 17th. The window between his decision to expose Pinnacle and his death was impossibly narrow, too narrow for coincidence. I spent that night spread across our living room floor, documents arranged in careful chronological order, trying to piece together what had really happened in Michael's final hours. The official medical report stated he'd suffered a massive stroke at his office around 2 p.m. His secretary had found him collapsed at his desk, conscious, but unable to speak clearly. By the time the ambulance arrived, he was already showing signs of severe neurological damage. But now I remembered details from that day that hadn't seemed important at the time. When I'd arrived at the hospital, Michael's secretary had seemed unusually nervous, avoiding eye contact and giving contradictory answers about who'd been in the office that morning. She'd mentioned that Michael had received several visitors, but when I'd asked for names, she'd claimed not to remember. The medical staff had also behaved strangely. They'd been reluctant to let me see Michael, immediately claiming they needed to run additional tests. When I'd finally been allowed into his room, he'd been sedated, connected to machines that made it impossible for him to communicate. The few moments when he'd seemed partially conscious, his eyes had held a frantic urgency that the doctors dismissed as confusion from brain damage. Most telling was what had happened after his death. His personal effects had disappeared before I could claim them. His phone, his wallet, even his wedding ring. The hospital claimed these items had been misplaced in the chaos of the emergency response, but I'd later learned that his secretary had cleaned out his office that same evening, supposedly on instructions from his supervisor. Someone had worked very quickly to eliminate any trace of what Michael had been working on in his final days. I called Rosa the next morning and asked her to meet me at a coffee shop near my school. When I explained my suspicions, she nodded grimly and told me she'd been thinking the same thing. She'd tried to visit Michael at the hospital, but had been told that only immediate family was allowed. When she'd called later to ask about his condition, the staff had claimed to have no record of any patient by that name. What would you do if you suspected a loved one was murdered for trying to do the right thing? Would you pursue the truth, even knowing it could put you in danger? Or would you let sleeping dogs lie? To protect yourself and the people you cared about, Rosa had been asking herself these questions for 6 months. She'd been too frightened to investigate Michael's death, too worried about protecting Lily, to risk drawing Pinnacle's attention. But she'd also been keeping records, documenting every interaction with Pinnacle's staff, every procedure they'd performed on her daughter, every consent form she'd never signed. Together we realized we had enough evidence to expose what Pinnacle was doing. But we also knew that Michael had tried to do the same thing, and it had cost him his life. The question was whether we had the courage to finish what he'd started. Rosa and I both understood that we couldn't take on Pinnacle alone. We needed allies, people with expertise, credibility, and resources that 2 grieving women couldn't provide. Our first call was to Ryan Foster Michael's former colleague at the engineering firm. Ryan had always struck me as one of the most principled people in Michael's professional circle, the kind of man who'd speak up when others stayed quiet. When I called him and mentioned Michael's name, there was a long pause before he agreed to meet us at a restaurant across town from both our neighborhoods. He arrived looking haggard, constantly glancing over his shoulder as if he expected to be followed. Before we could even explain why we'd contacted him, Ryan told us he'd been waiting for this conversation for months. He'd known something was wrong with Michael's death from the beginning, but he'd been too frightened to investigate on his own. Ryan revealed that he'd been receiving strange phone calls since Michael's funeral, people claiming to be from medical research companies, asking questions about Michael's work and whether he'd shared any sensitive information with colleagues. His office computer had been hacked twice, and someone had broken into his car, though nothing had been stolen. Most disturbing, Ryan had been approached by Pinnacle representatives who'd offered him a lucrative consulting contract, supposedly based on Michael's recommendation. The terms were generous, but vague, and something about the whole arrangement had felt like a test or a trap. Our next ally came from an unexpected source. Rosa had mentioned Nurse Jennifer Blake, the woman who'd seemed nervous whenever Michael visited the hospital for Lily's appointments. Jennifer had tried to warn Rosa about some of the procedures Pinnacle was requesting, subtle hints that the treatments weren't as routine as they claimed. When Rosa contacted Jennifer, the nurse agreed to meet us, but insisted on absolute secrecy. She worked at Valley Regional Medical Center, the same hospital where Michael had died, and she'd been asking her own questions about his case. Jennifer revealed that the medical team assigned to Michael's care had included several doctors she'd never seen before, specialists who'd claimed to be consulting on his case, but had no clear hospital affiliations. More troubling, Jennifer had noticed that Michael's medical records had been accessed multiple times after his death by people who had no legitimate reason to review them. When she tried to follow up on these irregularities, her supervisor had warned her to stop asking questions if she valued her job. But Jennifer's most valuable contribution was a contact she'd cultivated over years of witnessing medical ethics violations, Samantha Cross, the investigative journalist Michael had planned to meet. Samantha had been investigating Pinnacle for over a year, following tips from families who'd begun questioning the research protocols their children were subjected to. When we finally met Samantha at her cluttered office downtown, she spread out a wall chart that looked like something from a detective movie. Red string connected dozens of photographs and documents, mapping relationships between Pinnacle, its corporate partners, and government contractors. At the center of the web was a photograph of Dr. Rebecca Sterling, the woman who'd threatened Michael in his final meeting. Samantha had been building cases against several medical research companies that were exploiting vulnerable families, but Pinnacle was her priority target. She had sources inside the company, families willing to go on the record, and evidence of systematic fraud that went far beyond what Michael had uncovered. What she'd been missing was proof that Pinnacle was willing to kill to protect their operations. Michael's death provided that final piece of the puzzle, the evidence that would transform her investigation from a story about medical ethics violations into a story about murder. Building a legal case against Pinnacle required more than evidence. It required lawyers willing to take on a powerful corporation with connections throughout the medical establishment. Samantha introduced us to Patricia Mendez, a civil rights attorney who specialized in cases involving exploitation of vulnerable populations. Patricia's office felt like a war room, with boxes of legal documents stacked floor to ceiling and whiteboards covered in case timelines. She'd been following Pinnacle's activities for months, representing 3 other families whose children had been enrolled in research programs without proper consent. When we showed her Michael's evidence, her expression shifted from professional interest to genuine alarm. The challenge was proving Michael had been murdered. His death certificate listed natural causes, and getting it reopened would require new evidence that current authorities had missed or ignored. But Patricia had connections in the medical examiner's office, and she arranged for an independent pathologist to review Michael's case. Dr. Marcus Chen's analysis was devastating to Pinnacle's claims of innocence. Michael's toxicology report showed trace amounts of compounds that were consistent with drugs that could trigger stroke-like symptoms in healthy individuals. These substances wouldn't show up in routine screenings and would metabolize quickly, leaving only subtle markers that would be dismissed as natural brain chemistry fluctuations. More importantly, Dr. Chen identified needle marks on Michael's arms that were inconsistent with the IV lines inserted during his medical treatment. Someone had injected Michael with something before he'd reached the hospital, and the injection sites had been carefully disguised to look like routine medical procedures. The legal strategy Patricia developed was multifaceted. We would file wrongful death suits against Pinnacle while simultaneously pursuing criminal charges for fraud, conspiracy, and murder. But the most powerful weapon in our arsenal was the threat of public exposure through Samantha's journalism. Pinnacle's entire business model depended on maintaining their reputation as a legitimate medical research facility. If families discovered they were essentially selling their children's genetic material to defense contractors, the company would lose access to the vulnerable populations they depended on for research subjects. The court proceedings began in November 2004, 8 months after Michael's death. Pinnacle's legal team was formidable, expensive attorneys who tried to discredit our evidence and paint Michael as an unstable fraud, who'd created elaborate conspiracy theories to justify his criminal document forgery. But they couldn't explain away the needle marks, the missing phone records, or the testimony from multiple witnesses who'd seen Michael being followed in the days before his death. Jennifer Blake's testimony was particularly damaging as she described the unusual medical team that had treated Michael and the systematic deletion of his medical records after his death. Rosa's testimony brought the human cost of Pinnacle's operations into sharp focus. She described watching her 6-year-old daughter subjected to increasingly invasive procedures, signing consent forms for treatments she didn't understand, trusting people who saw Lily as nothing more than a valuable source of genetic material. The turning point came when Patricia presented internal Pinnacle documents that explicitly discussed eliminating obstacles to their Phase 3 implementation. While the language was carefully coded, the context made it clear they were discussing Michael and other parents who'd become problematic to their research goals. Dr. Sterling's deposition was a masterclass in corporate damage control, but her careful non-answers and selective memory loss only reinforced the impression that Pinnacle was hiding something significant. The jury deliberated for 3 days before delivering a verdict that would reshape how medical research involving children was regulated across the country. Pinnacle Bio Research Corporation was found liable for wrongful death, fraud, conspiracy, and violation of medical ethics standards. The financial damages awarded to our legal team were substantial, but more importantly, the court ordered a complete shutdown of Pinnacle's operations pending a federal investigation. Dr. Rebecca Sterling was arrested on charges of conspiracy to commit murder, medical fraud, and violation of federal research ethics regulations. The evidence against her was overwhelming recorded phone conversations, internal emails discussing threats against Michael, and testimony from other Pinnacle employees who'd grown uncomfortable with the company's increasingly aggressive tactics. But the victory extended far beyond our individual case. Samantha Cross's investigative series, published simultaneously with the court verdict, exposed a nationwide network of research facilities that were exploiting children with rare genetic conditions. Her articles documented systematic abuse at facilities across 12 states, revealing that Pinnacle had been part of a larger conspiracy involving pharmaceutical companies, defense contractors, and corrupt medical researchers. The public response was immediate and explosive. Congressional hearings were launched within weeks, led by representatives who'd been horrified by the revelations about children being treated as experimental subjects without proper oversight. The hearings revealed that federal agencies responsible for overseeing medical research had been either incompetent or complicit in allowing these abuses to continue. Lily Martinez became the face of reform, though we were careful to protect her privacy throughout the legal proceedings. Her case demonstrated how vulnerable children could be exploited by people who claimed to be helping them, and her recovery under proper medical supervision proved that ethical treatment was both possible and more effective than the invasive procedures Pinnacle had subjected her to. The financial settlement allowed Rosa to quit her exhausting healthcare job and focus full-time on caring for Lily while advocating for other families in similar situations. She started a foundation that provided legal support and medical advocacy for parents navigating complex research protocols, ensuring they understood exactly what they were agreeing to before signing any consent forms. Ryan Foster used his engineering expertise to develop new data security protocols that would make it harder for research facilities to hide their activities from oversight agencies. He also testified before Congress about the corporate culture that had allowed Pinnacle to operate without adequate supervision, recommending changes to how medical research partnerships were structured and monitored. Jennifer Blake received federal whistleblower protections and a substantial reward for her courage in exposing the medical irregularities surrounding Michael's death. She used her newfound financial security to pursue additional training in medical ethics, eventually becoming an ombudsman who helped patients and families navigate complex medical situations. The broader impact was transformative. New federal regulations required independent oversight of all research involving children, mandatory cooling-off periods before parents could consent to experimental procedures, and criminal penalties for researchers who violated ethical standards. Medical facilities were required to maintain transparent records of all procedures and to provide families with independent advocates during consent processes. Most satisfying was watching other families come forward with their own stories of exploitation and abuse. The courage we'd found in pursuing justice for Michael had inspired dozens of other people to speak up about research facilities that had treated their children as commodities rather than patients. The months following the trial were strange and disorienting. For almost a year, my entire existence had been consumed by the investigation, the legal proceedings, and the fight for justice. Suddenly, with Pinnacle shut down and Dr. Sterling awaiting sentencing, I found myself facing a question I hadn't considered. What do you do with your life after you fought the biggest battle you'll ever fight? Rosa and I had become unlikely friends through our shared ordeal. The woman I'd initially seen as a threat to my marriage had become one of the most important people in my life. We met regularly for coffee sometimes to discuss ongoing legal matters, but increasingly just to talk about ordinary things, her struggles with single motherhood, my return to teaching, the strange process of rebuilding our lives after trauma. Lily was thriving under proper medical supervision. Her rare genetic condition still required monitoring and treatment, but now she was receiving care from doctors who saw her as a patient rather than a research subject. The invasive procedures Pinnacle had subjected her to had stopped, and she was responding well to less aggressive treatments that respected her dignity as a child. I started spending time with Lily, something that had initially felt awkward and painful, but gradually became one of the most healing aspects of my new reality. She was a remarkable child, resilient, curious, and surprisingly wise for someone who'd endured so much medical trauma. When she learned I'd been married to her daddy Mike, she began including me in her prayers, asking whatever higher power she believed in to make sure he knew she was safe now. Teaching became my refuge again, but with a new perspective. I found myself paying closer attention to students who seemed overwhelmed by adult responsibilities, kids who were navigating complex family situations or medical challenges. My experience with Pinnacle had taught me to recognize when institutions claim to be helping vulnerable people while actually exploiting them. I developed new curriculum units about medical ethics and scientific integrity, teaching my biology students to think critically about research claims and to understand their rights as potential research subjects. Many of my colleagues thought I was being overly cautious, but I'd seen firsthand how easily people could be manipulated by authority figures who claimed to have their best interests at heart. The financial settlement from the lawsuit allowed me to make changes I'd never thought possible. I paid off our mortgage and established a scholarship fund for students pursuing careers in medical ethics or patient advocacy. I also began volunteering with Rosa's Foundation, using my teaching skills to help other families understand complex medical documents and research protocols. Most surprisingly, I found myself becoming a public speaker. Organizations working on medical reform invited me to share my story at conferences and congressional hearings. Standing in front of audiences and describing Michael's death and our fight for justice felt terrifying at first, but I discovered that my voice was powerful when I used it to protect vulnerable people. The hardest part was learning to forgive Michael for the deception that had defined our final years together. I couldn't condone the document forgery or the lies he'd told me, but I'd come to understand the impossible situation he'd faced. He'd seen a child suffering and chosen action over inaction, even knowing it would complicate his life in ways he couldn't predict. 20 years have passed since I discovered the truth about Michael's death, and I'm telling this story now because I believe it's more relevant than ever. Medical research has become increasingly sophisticated, and the potential for exploitation has grown alongside legitimate scientific advances. Families facing rare diseases are still vulnerable to people who would take advantage of their desperation. And the need for vigilance remains as urgent today as it was in 2004. I never remarried. Some people assume this means I never moved past my grief over Michael, but that's not accurate. I learned to distinguish between mourning the man I'd loved and grieving the marriage I'd thought we'd had. Those were separate losses that required different kinds of healing. Lily is 26 now, a graduate student studying bioethics with a focus on pediatric research protections. She calls me Aunt Vicky and visits every few months, bringing updates on her research and stories about her life. The little girl who'd been treated as a commodity by Pinnacle has become a powerful advocate for children's rights in medical settings. Michael would be proud of the woman she's become. Rosa and I remain close friends, though our relationship has evolved as Lily grew up and needed us less. She remarried 5 years ago to a man who understood her history and embraced his role as Lily's stepfather. Watching Rosa build a new life with someone who respected her strength rather than trying to fix her trauma taught me important lessons about what healthy love looks like. I kept teaching until I was 62, retiring early to focus full-time on advocacy work. The foundation Rosa and I built has helped hundreds of families navigate complex medical research situations, and we've prevented several cases where children were being exploited by institutions that claim to be helping them. Each family we assist feels like a small victory in Michael's memory. The regulatory changes that resulted from our case have held up well over the past 2 decades. Medical research involving children is now subject to much stricter oversight, and families have better protections against exploitation. But vigilance remains essential. New technologies create new opportunities for abuse, and desperate families will always be vulnerable to people who promise miracle cures. I removed my wedding ring in 2006, not because I'd stopped loving Michael, but because I'd finally understood that moving forward didn't require carrying the weight of his secrets. I kept the ring, and I still wear it on special occasions that would have mattered to him. Lily's graduations, Rosa's wedding, the anniversary of Pinnacle's shutdown. But most days, my hands are free to do the work that grows out of his legacy, rather than being bound by the complications of his choices. How do you find the strength to forgive the unforgivable? I've learned that forgiveness isn't about forgetting or excusing harmful actions. It's about understanding why people make the choices they do and finding ways to honor their good intentions while acknowledging the damage their mistakes created. Michael saw a child suffering and tried to help her even when his methods were wrong. In the end, he tried to make it right, and that effort cost him his life. I believe that defines us, not our mistakes, but our willingness to fight for justice when we recognize we've caused harm. That's a lesson worth remembering, whether you're facing medical research decisions, supporting vulnerable family members, or simply trying to live with integrity in a complicated world.